The Iraq War. The Iraqi War was a very drawn-out war that really started in 1991 till 2011. Much more happens throughout this whole time period. So here is the Iraq War. So the prelude to the Iraq War was first started in 1990, which was the invasion of Kuwait, when it ended in Iraq's defeat by U.S. coalition force. However, Saddam Hussein, the head of the Ba'ath Party, which was in formation of the Arabian Socialist Nation, managed to retain power by suppressing an uprising of an ethnic group whom are called the Kurds. Soon, the Allies established a safe haven in northern Iraq's predominantly Kurdish regions, and Allied warplanes patrolled no-fly zones in northern and southern Iraq that were off-limits to Iraqi aircrafts. This was known as Operation Provide Comfort. Later, the United Nations implemented economic sanctions against Iraq, among other things, hindered the progress of lethal arms programs. With the UN weapons ban, repeated interference with inspections angered the international community and led U.S. President Bill Clinton in 1998 to order the bombings of several Iraqi military installations. This was known as Operation Desert Fox. In 2002, the new U.S. President George W. Bush argued that the vulnerability of the United States following the September 11 attacks of 2001, combined with Iraq's alleged continued possession and manufacture of weapons of mass destruction, made disarming Iraq a renewed priority. In case you didn't know already, the Iraq War did take place in Iraq. No duh. But the people who did fight in Iraq was America, Great Britain, and the Iranian forces. 2003, and the United States responded to a bombing in Iraq's capital, and George W. Bush responded with this in televisions.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
President Bush and his advisors built much of their case for the war on the idea that Saddam Hussein had access to weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein wanted these weapons of mass destruction because it would give him a power over other nations, like a scare tactic, so to speak. Soon, the US imposed a deadline for Saddam Hussein to leave Iraq or face the consequences. Obviously, Saddam refused to leave, which would lead to the US attacking. When the US attacked, the first target, which President Bush said was of military importance, was hit by Tomahawk cruise missiles from US fighter bombers and warships which were stationed in the Persian Gulf. Saddam Hussein had declared in early March 2003 that it would be without a doubt that the faithful will be victorious against aggression. He went into hiding soon after the American invasion, speaking to his people only through an occasional audio tape. Coalition forces were able to topple his regime and capture Iraq's major cities in just 3 weeks. Sustaining few casualties, President Bush will declare the end of the major combat operations on May 1st, 2003. Despite the defeat of conventional military forces in Iraq, an insurgency had continued an intense guerrilla warfare in the nation in the years since military victory was announced, resulting in thousands of coalition military insurgents and civilian deaths. In June 2004, the provisional government in place since soon after Saddam's ouster transferred power to the Iraqi interim government. In January 2005, the Iraqi people elected a 275-member Iraqi National Assembly. A constitution for the country was ratified that October. On November 6, 2006, Saddam Hussein was found guilty of his crimes against humanity and sentenced to death by hanging. After an unsuccessful appeal, he was executed on December 30th, 2006. No weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq, but it would be later known that it would be impossible for the Ba'ath regime to create weapons of mass destruction. Even though Saddam Hussein was executed, the Iraq War would not be over. Now, with the collapse with the Ba'athist regime, Iraq's major cities erupted in massive waves of looting that was directed mostly towards the government offices and other public institutions, and there were severe outbreaks of violence, both common and criminal violence, and acts of reprisal against the former ruling clique. Restoring law and order was one of the most arduous tasks for occupying forces, one that made worse by continuing attacks against occupying troops that soon developed into full-scale guerrilla warfare. Increasingly, the conflict came to identified as a civil war, although the Bush administration generally avoided using that term and instead preferred the label sectarian violence. Coalition casualties have been light in the initial 2003 combat and about 150 deaths by May 1st. However, deaths of U.S. troops soared thereafter, reaching some 1,000 in November 2004. In addition, several hundred soldiers from other coalition countries have been killed. The number of Iraqis who died during the conflict is uncertain. One estimate made in late 2006 put the total at more than 650,000 between the U.S.-led invasion and October 2006. This part of the war is named the Surge because a high amount of U.S. troops were sent to the Iraq. Here's more about the Surge. Prior to the release of the Iraqi Study Group report, there had been considerable debate within the administration over the path forward in Iraq. Although by December 2006, President Bush had indicated his inclination to increase the number of troops in Iraq, question in particular, the exact number of troops to be added, remained unsettled. Finally, in January 2007, President Bush announced a controversial plan to temporarily increase the number of U.S. troops, thereby more than 20,000, an effort that became known as the Surge. Despite heavy casualties initially, 2007 was the deadliest year for U.S. forces since 2004. A drop in violence that occurred as the year drew on was a source of encouragement, and a number of the additional troops were subsequently within the ultimate success of the Surge itself, remained a source of continuing debate. However, as the declining levels of violence observed in 2007 were attributed not solely to the Surge itself, but confluence of factors among these. In November 2008, the Iraq Parliament approved a U.S. and Iraqi agreement that re-identified the legal framework of U.S. military activity in Iraq and set a timetable for the final withdrawal of U.S. forces under the agreement, which was signed during the final months of Bush administration. After nearly a year of negotiation, U.S. troops were scheduled to leave the cities by mid-2009 and withdraw by the country was set to complete it by 2011, which was on December 31st. In February 2009, newly elected U.S. President Barack Obama announced that U.S. combat forces would be withdrawn from Iraq in August 2010, with the remaining troops due to pull out at the end of 2011. On August 18, 2010, 2 weeks ahead of schedule, the last combat brigade withdrew from Iraq. 50,000 U.S. soldiers remained in Iraq to act as a traditional force.
In contrast to publicly known U.S. military casualty figures tracked by the Pentagon to more than 4,300 in October 2009, for a number of years, no comprehensive data on Iraqi mortality was made available by the Iraqi government. In October 2009, the Iraqi government released its estimate of violent deaths for the 2004 and 2008 period. Statistics for the earliest portion of the war were far more difficult to obtain due to the lack of functioning government at the time. According to the government estimate, more than 85,000 Iraqis a figure that includes both civilians and military personnel, had died violently in the 4 years.
In July 2011, U.S. military officials announced that Iraq and the United States had begun negotiations to keep several thousand U.S. soldiers in Iraq past December 31, 2011, the date for withdrawal set in negotiations in 2008. However, a possible extension for the U.S. presence in Iraq remained unpopular with the Iraq public and with several Iraq political factions. Negotiations failed when the two sides were unable to reach an agreement over the continuation for U.S. troops of legal immunity from the Iraq law. In October, President Obama announced that the remaining 39,000 soldiers would leave the country at the end of 2011. The U.S. military formally declared the end of its mission in Iraq in a ceremony in Baghdad on December 15th as the final U.S. troops prepared to withdraw from the country.
Now we are at the end. You have now heard the Iraq War. This war has changed history, and we still see the effects today.